Welcome to Pour Decisions of GTM, where we share sips, slips, and tips in an unfiltered discussion that helps GTM leaders move from mediocre to top shelf quality. Join us as we spill our tea on lessons learned, on what not to do, and what we can do to produce better results going forward. I'm Elizabeth Italiano.
And I'm Indu Sudhakar.
And we're the hosts of Pour Decisions of GTM. And today we are joined by our special guest, Peter Armaly. Peter, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Indu, for having me on your wonderful show. So, Peter Armaly, I'm a principal at ValueWise Consulting at the moment. And, as far as this show goes and go to market, I'm kind of stumbling over my background. It's just pretty extensive. And I'm known most recently for my roles in customer success, but I span the entire kind of gamut of go to market, including sales, time of sales and services support, and even marketing and product. Actually, I did about 2 years in the product about 20 years ago. So I feel like I've touched all the areas and have an intimate knowledge of how the machinery operates and can operate and doesn't operate. So I have a lot of opinions.
Yes, and I often agree with your opinion. So I look forward to hearing more. And I can confirm that on the go-to-market, the full spectrum. I think in all of our discussions that we've had, Peter, we have touched on every point of GTM at one time or another.
Yep, that's true.
So the premise of today is that we'll be sharing some slips and tips over a drink together. But before we get to that, let's address one of the most important questions. What are you sipping on today as we spill our tea with our audience?
So normally I would say at this time of day, well, not every single day, but it would be very comfortable for me to have a glass of wine, winding down the day, maybe doing some writing. But today, because I spent the weekend in the Niagara region, I went to a wedding and we did 2 days of wine tasting. So I want to take a break. So I'm having a double espresso at the moment. Sorry.
Oh, nothing wrong with a double espresso. And I will enjoy my Bordeaux for the both of us.
Nice.
So this is our first recording of Poor Decisions. That's in the late afternoon, early evening. So Indu and I decided that we would pour ourselves a glass of wine. I'm drinking red, obviously the Bordeaux. Indu,
I've got Pinot Grigio, so got it balanced out here.
Yeah. And, sometimes I like when I'm writing or getting deep into work, I will pour a little glass of wine. So
Well,
cheers
it's
to,
it's very appropriate, Elizabeth. Every time we get together, we have wine anyways. So it's
yeah, it was like the last time I was like, if Peter drinks wine, I'll drink wine. And so I waited and put it on you. And that was unfair of me. So anyway. All right. Well, now that we know what each of us is sipping, let's move on to some other topics that are focused on go-to-market.
Yes. So, Peter, you've spanned all parts of go-to-market, as you just said. Just let's kick it off by understanding what you feel like your biggest mistake was, or a mistake that you've experienced during all of your time in go-to-market.
Yeah, because I've worked for a lot of companies, I think I've experienced a lot of great successes, not just personal ones, but being part of teams that have had a lot of success in the go-to-market motions that they're all each are responsible for. But I want to call it a very kind of personal one where it didn't go so well, because I think it's illustrative of how a leader can make mistakes. So I was in charge of the software consultants in Canada for BMC software for a number of years. And so I had a big team and I looked at my team. I was very proud of the mix of skills and how we're going to market, supporting a broad portfolio of types of products and solutions and broad industry verticals. So it's pretty complicated go to market, but I thought we had a weakness in cybersecurity. So the next opening on our team, I intentionally focused on recruiting someone who had cybersecurity technical knowledge and experience. I know I over-rotated on that. And I lowered the priority for what I think now, or I soon realized, should be the top priority for solution engineers or solution consultants is really communication skills and the ability to persuade. This individual did not possess those things, even at a minimal level, but they were experts. They were an expert at cybersecurity, and I fell in love with that. So hired him, and he succeeded on that front, but failed on the other stuff. And it really caused ripple effects in the sales team, because the sales team, would come to me and say, wonderful guy, fantastic, but we don't have those kinds of deep conversations with customers so much, or prospects anyways. Maybe with customers they do, but not so much with prospects. And so he's not really someone we need in our pre-sales motions. So I think, I think I just made a big mistake by not involving others in that kind of conversation to hire a certain type of persona. I relied, I guess I'm beating around the bush. It was hubris. I was overconfident in my capabilities as a leader at that point and just went solo on the decision. I don't regret hiring the individual. I'm still in touch with him. He's moved on in a more appropriate role in development, and he's very successful now. But at the time, it was a failed experiment. And the reason I think it's appropriate for this conversation is because I think, it had ripple effects through the sales organization. It even affected some deals, frankly. So.
Okay. So if you go back to kind of the root cause, so you mentioned your hubris, was there anything that you sort of looked at when you looked at the sales experience that you can kind of unpack as like the root cause as to, why the mistake was made? What kind of led you there, and what would you tell Peter then if you could go back in time?
I think, well, the timing of that hire was at a time when the company was transforming into a broader business strategy. And Mark Stoos. Mark Stoos was at the time, our chief communications officer, and he was kind of one of the creators of the strategy called business service management. That's when we kind of got to know each other. And so people like me out in the field were responsible for making sure that that new strategy was rolled out in very targeted markets. And so it meant for me anyways, very serious leaders like me, that how do you change the complexion of your team to reflect the nuances of a new strategy? And so I think that's all good so far, right? Thinking that way and trying to execute that way. But where I think I failed was the whole Canadian kind of workforce of that company at the time was in flux too. And I think I just didn't have any kind of trusted confidants that I could kind of collaborate with to make the right sort of hiring, set the right sort of hiring criteria. And so I think I just moved too quickly on that. I think I wanted to fill the role and show my kind of determination and ability to kind of execute with precision. And on the one hand, I did, because I did it quickly with a really high quality technical hire. Unfortunately, I minimized the other pieces of it that, in retrospect, were far more important, really. When you think about go to market, so much of it depends on collaboration and communicating and working seamlessly across teams. And this guy was not suited for that, frankly. So.
Yeah, that cohesion is so important. You could have the right person for the role, but if it's not the right person for the organization or the cohesion you need in partnering with other teams, it can definitely be a challenge. I'm curious, you mentioned there was a ripple effect across the sales team and the organization. What did you see this mistake sort of result in ultimately?
So it meant that there were opportunities that should have progressed faster, given that their company was trying to put a spotlight on security solutions as part of this new strategy. And so logically, you would think that those kinds of opportunities would be, promoted more heavily. And they were, but we didn't. When it came time to actually getting in front of prospects or at events, even doing presentations at events, he couldn't do that piece of it. And so I had to bring in more overlay specialists from the United States. And so there's kind of that wasted kind of money budget to bring in people when I probably should have had someone local to handle that kind of stuff. So that's one thing. But then just even the opportunities themselves, if he got involved in opportunities, again, the prospects would like him because he's a likable person, but his ability to kind of like persuade or even to clearly communicate the value proposition, the business value proposition, he struggled there. So he'd have more conversations than necessary. And so the cycle was slowed down. And that frustrated the account executives who I got along with really well. I would collaborate with those people all the time. And so they trusted me. And I think their esteem for me as a good, solid manager kind of dropped a notch or two because of that. And that's, for me, that's fine. That's part of being a manager. You make mistakes like that. But I felt bad that I was affecting, their prospects to make some money and close some deals and that sort of thing. So there were some deals that not just slipped, but failed. They just closed, lost sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this touches on something that I see in a lot of organizations where, there are decisions that are made in silos where there's not that collaboration that you talked about, but you also mentioned not having that sounding board and someone to talk to. And I think that's, whether we're working in a 10-person organization or a 500 or 1,000, having people that you can talk through these things with is really important. And I see so many leaders, particularly new ones, that do want to prove that, their worth and their ability and their capability, that they go it alone. So what I'm hearing in some of this is that you wouldn't go it alone quite the same way.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I learned from that experience. And I guess it's also important to point out that what I was going through at the time in terms of my professional career growth at that moment was I was part of the North America, we're part of the whole North America sales organization. And so our VP of solution consulting in front of an all hands, like the entire solution consulting organization, said that the best team in North America is the Canadian team. And here's why. And she listed all the reasons. And it was like, wow, I was pretty proud at the time. And I think that's what I meant when I said I was a little overconfident. I think it went to my head a little bit. I was very proud of the team I had built. I thought it was super complementary of each other, the skills, the overlaid technology capabilities, the personalities. And I thought I could just by myself plug someone else right in there. And even if that person was weak on a few things, we could bring them up, or I could bring them up. And, that's just, I should have slowed down that higher when I think about that. So.
I think that's great advice. And so that, once you realized, okay, there is an issue here, how did you overcome this with your team?
Yeah. So and the team also liked that person, but they also saw the issue, right? And so what I said was, well, the team is also in need of operational help. At the time, it was before a lot of the kind of the cloud-based offerings to do, canned demos and all that kind of stuff. And so you had to build your own demo environments, sometimes with hardware, specialized hardware, and we'd have to use oftentimes remote into, systems based in Houston or something like that. But we had local, hardware we could use. And so I thought, let's have him be our operational support for our team. And he could build the demo environments for each of the different kind of product areas. And he loved that. He was great at it. And they loved him doing that because it freed them up. So I solved it in a way by leveraging his skills, but that's not what the role was meant to do. It's like he's hired to be a customer facing, prospect facing persuader, technical person who can kind of convince you to buy a solution based on its capabilities to satisfy your business goals. He was not good at that, but he's good on the technical pieces, right? And so that I knew, even though I was put that in place, I knew that wasn't a long-term answer. And so I was making progress on the back end, trying to kind of move him into a different area of the business, which eventually happened. But it was about a year-long experiment that didn't work out. It worked out for him. It worked in terms of he went with the company for a long time after that, and very successfully, but in a role that was far more suitable for him. But we wasted basically a lot of sales opportunities in the process. So.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point too around finding a different role for him. So sometimes when someone's not working out in a role, a lot of companies and leaders will just jump to, okay, we're going to let go of this.
Let him go.
Yeah.
Yeah. But sometimes it's okay, well, they're not in the right seat on the bus right now. So let's move them into something that's a better fit, and sometimes, there might not be a role that's a good fit, but I think it's important to look at, okay, is there somewhere that they slot in that's going to be, a benefit and a good fit for, all parties involved. So yeah, kudos to you, because a lot of people would just jump to the you're fired.
Well, and I was getting pressure to do that
Yeah.
by our country manager, who was a sales guy, who's my boss. But I managed to, because I was pretty good at persuade him to to give me a little bit more leash, and I'll take care of it. And I did, and he calmed down. So.
And I think it takes a special kind of leader to recognize, okay, these are actually the skills that you have, and this is a role that's suited for you. A lot of people or a lot of leaders don't make that connection, which results in sort of the path we typically see of just letting someone go. So
when especially
you already don't find that.
Yeah, and especially Indu, when there's a discrepancy in the compensation that he had to understand, he had to kind of go down to the other role, but it was more suitable for him. But solution consulting is a well-paid part of the business, and so, but there's risk, of course, and he wasn't doing the risk side, which is the up in front of customers, putting your kind of reputation on the line, trying to persuade in the moment, sort of thing. So
yeah, to some extent, you find something that's probably personally more of a fit for him, so it's kind of a win-win, regardless of what those changes are. That role, in my experience, it's so hard to hire for that role, where you have to kind of straddle the technical and the business acumen side of the house. If you were to redo this whole situation over again, I know you mentioned leaning on more of the team and getting more input. Is there anything you would advise to other GTM leaders to do differently if they were in a similar position?
Yeah, I'd advise them to, basically test run people who shortlist people, get them in front of your group, and have them do a pitch and tell them, here's the customer you're trying to present to, or the prospect you're trying to present to, and here's their business challenge, and you have 45 minutes to persuade them that you're the right vendor of choice. And obviously they're not going to understand your product to the degree it needs to be, but I think you could prove the qualities that we're talking about around the business domain experience and acumen, and show those qualities, the communication qualities I'm talking about, right? So I think maybe it's different nowadays. I suspect not, because I spent 6 years at Oracle. I knew a lot of solution consultants there too, and they were really strong on actually knew the VP who enabled for enablement for solution consulting, and he engineered that whole program to really focus on communications primarily. I mean, obviously the technical stuff is a given. You have to have that technical knowledge, but he wouldn't put anyone in the program who didn't have that kind of primary kind of skills, high quality skills around communications.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because actually some of the best SCs or SEs I've learned from have come from Oracle. It's definitely a very good program.
Yeah, it's pretty rigid there.
Yeah, they do a good job.
They take it very seriously there.
Yeah.
Okay, Peter, thanks for all of that insight. I think there's a lot to be learned there for current leaders and future leaders around things to think through when they're hiring. Anything else that you would add before we continue on to other topics?
Just around, I think we touched on it a little bit, but I feel like the example I gave is for me just another good kind of use case for why collaboration is necessary. And I know we talk in today's environment about go to market in a much bigger way, but I think not the unspoken, but the quiet part of that is that so much of it depends on high quality kind of conversation and coordination and collaboration, and that it essentially relies on the ability to kind of communicate with people and win them over and persuade them about doing the right thing, and vice versa. So I think that, for me, that example I gave is just kind of a small microcosm of that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The quality of communication, and you referenced persuasion a number of times now, and I think it's so key, because We've come out of this growth at all costs era where, sales and retaining clients were relatively easy compared to periods outside of that. And now, the economic conditions that we find ourselves in. And, it's not the quantity game anymore, it's the quality. And the power of persuasion, I think, is really important. So I'm glad that you called that out, because I think that's one of the things in any hire that I'd be making would be, can you persuade? Can you tell a story that persuades? Yeah, I think that's a great call.
And it's true of not just leaders, right? I think individual contributors need to be able to understand that there's an important factor for them and being able to do that. And persuade doesn't mean brainwash people or, fool them or anything like that, right?
Oh, I think that, yeah, that's a good call out as well. There's nothing negative about
Nefarious.
persuasion. It's, we identified your problem. We know we can help solve that problem. And so now we're persuading you that we're a good partner for you. So yeah, and there's nothing negative about that. So I want to touch on something. You were a little humble in your introduction and didn't mention that you are a published author. So in case anybody's missed the book, I have a copy of it right here. Peter is the author of Mastering Customer Success. And, I've read through most of the book, and there's some fantastic advice, not just for CS, but go-to-market leaders, that are either directly involved with CS or collaborate closely. So one of the things that you mentioned in your book, and it's on page 8 for anyone who has the book or is going to get the book, because if you don't have the book, go to Amazon and order it right now. You will not regret it. It's very well written. And I honestly usually don't like business books, but I like this one. But on page 8, you discuss that all projects that are conducted within a business, but they really should align with an overarching business strategy, and that leaders really should focus on being very relentless on alignment. And so with customer success, we see a lot of silos, and they can often be on an island of their own, but that silo exists all across go-to-market. I mean, how many times have we heard sales and marketing are siloed, product is siloed from the customer-facing team? So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen companies make on alignment?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Elizabeth, for catching me on my humility. It is a kind of a weakness of mine. So I appreciate you calling that out and mentioning the book. That was a labor. That was a labor of love. I've been on podcasts talking about the book a bit, and I call it a homage to CSMs, because it's not written for leaders so much as it's written for individual contributors. And again, like you said, Elizabeth, it's not just for customer success. There's a lot of good takeaways for almost any individual in any organization, because it's mostly about how do you do your work. I think the biggest mistakes I see people make is being too kind of narrowly focused on their own organization's interests. And that, while that's natural because that's how you're measured as a leader, that's how your performance is measured. That's what your boss expects you to do, hit certain KPIs, for your team to hit certain KPIs. I think it's a weakness to too narrowly focus on that and deprioritize or put on a second tier how all that fits into the overall strategy of the company. I think you're doing a disservice by not reminding, or first of all, educating your team about what the overall strategy is. They might hear about it on the website, they might hear about it at the company all hands, but it doesn't come to life for them until you put it into words that make sense for their job, for the tasks that they're conducting. And I mentioned this a lot in the book. And I think part of it comes from, I had a brief experience just before university where I worked for 3 months in a engine factory in Windsor, Ford Motor Company. Summer job, awful. It was just horrible environment it's humane, but it was just awful place because the job was very mind-numbing. And I say it because the job was very repetitive. And even though you might move around stations and stuff, you're just working with pieces and parts. And so you never see the product. Obviously, I knew it was going to be a car or a truck or something, but I didn't have any idea what this camshaft looked like when it fit into I don't know, an engine block or whatever. I'm not a car guy, so I don't understand how these things fit together. But my point is that it's demoralizing, at least it was to me, to do this work all the time and not understand how it fits into the bigger picture. And so the metaphor is, if you're in the go-to-market roles, I think it's important for leaders to help people understand that the work they're doing affects the needle at the big level, the revenue needles. So you've heard your CEO say, we're going to grow our market share 18% this year. Okay, sounds nice. What does that mean for marketing? What does it mean for sales organizations? What does it mean for customer success? What is that? Are there different expectations, and why different expectations? A lot of pressure these days on customer success to focus more on revenue, but why is that? Well, we know, people who like us who know and understand what's happening in the industry know there's a lot of pressures on CFOs, and investors demand a lot more. And so all organizations have to figure out how to kind of squeeze revenue. And so customer success is no exception. And so I think if you're a leader, you have to double down on being able to clearly communicate that direct line between the work that your people are doing and how that moves the needles at the highest level. And if you can't figure out how to say that, then you should talk to your boss, who should be able to communicate that to you. And, I don't think I say this in the book. My first job in management, the VP, who was in charge of all the sales in North America, I was a manager of, in Canada, solution consulting. I got promoted from individual contributor. And he called me and said, congratulations, you got the worst job in the whole company right now. And he said, I know you're going to be great at it, but it really is the worst, because you're on the front line and you're responsible for making sure every single one of those people understand what the big mission is and that they execute it every single day. And your boss only has to worry about you, but you have to worry about 14 or 15 people spread across the country right now. So I hope that answers the question, Elizabeth. I think it's ultimately that I take leadership very, very seriously. And I think if you want to be a leader, that characteristic of seeing big picture and how do you make that big picture come to life through small actions is a big skill to have.
Yeah, absolutely. You need to be able to understand what everything ladders up to at the end of the day. And I think it's mutually beneficial, right? Like, I think about when I was a salesperson transitioning to more of a post-sales growth role, I became a much better salesperson understanding that side of the house than I had ever been before. So as an IC director, whatnot, learning those sort of cross-functional roles and what you're all building up towards definitely helps. I'm curious, when you talk about this being sort of a blind spot with leaders today, really rallying up to that similar goal and making everyone kind of have this cohesive goal in mind, what do you think is preventing them from getting there, besides being so zoned in on your specific role and what to do?
I think general busyness. There's so much change that's happening these days, much more so than it was 10 or 15 years ago. I think technology is changing so rapidly. And I mean, it's just a cliche now that generative AI is introducing a lot of uncertainties. It's not just introducing change, it's introducing uncertainties, because I just read today that the tech industry, there's layoffs, and it's because companies are making decisions based on what they anticipate Gen AI is going to do, without even any proof at this time yet. So I mean, I use it a lot, and I know you do, Elizabeth, use it a lot, and a lot of people use it a lot, but I think companies are still not using it systemically a lot. But I think there's anticipation that that's going to happen. So there's a lot of hiring decisions deferred. There's a lot of layoffs because of that. And so I think that all that flux of change and uncertainty is causing leaders to be too busy in their own minds sometimes. And it takes a lot of intention, a lot of focus to know that your number one job is to get your people to execute their mission. It's not about you so much. I think,
Mhm.
you know what your goals are, you know what your personal goals are, but your personal goals won't matter if your team's not going to execute. And so that's should be your primary responsibility as a leader, is making sure your team is cared for in the sense that they have what they need to perform in their role. If that happens, then a lot of the other things take care of themselves. And so what that means is you have to have clarity of purpose, as much clear thinking as possible. And that means you have to have really clear communication with your superiors, your bosses, to make sure that they are providing you with information that you need so you can kind of get your team to execute, but also with as much advanced knowledge, awareness as possible, so that you're removing hurdles for them. It's not an easy job these days. I think leadership today is harder than it was when I was doing it when I was leading organizations. And I think it's harder, not because teams are bigger, not because anyone's more independent, not because of Gen Z, none of that stuff. I think it's just because there's just so much more change that's happening. And yeah, some of the stuff is generational influences and stuff, but it's also because the world's more chaotic now.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Financial markets are changing all the time. And so, it'd be stupid to think that you can do all this in a vacuum. You can't. But what you can do is just try to be as intentional as possible, and make sure that you have a good relationship with your bosses, so that they are enabling you as much as possible.
Yeah, it's a really good point about the change. Like the velocity of change is certainly unlike anything that I've experienced in my
Mhm.
19-year career. And so it's the what, and then it's the why. Like as you were talking, it's like, okay, explaining why. The what isn't enough. And I remember the first time that, and looking back, it was so obvious, in hindsight, that I really grasped how important it was to give the why. An organization that I was leading, the CS and account management team, we basically decided, okay, these are our ICP, this is who we're building for, and these are now our bad fit customers, and we had a bad fit customer program. So we didn't want to sell to these certain segments anymore, and we had a plan to migrate them away. Anyway, make a long story short, the sales team was still, despite changes in comp and all these other reasons, they were still selling to these bad fit customers. And so myself and the sales leader, and it was creating a lot of angst with the CS team, because of course that was turning into churn. Anyway, the moment that I will never forget is when one of the AEs said, well, isn't a few months of revenue better than no revenue at all? Because the contracts were month to month. And I was like, oh my gosh, they don't, or not all of them, but they didn't think, like they didn't know the why behind,
Yeah.
CAC, customer acquisition costs, and the payback period. And so all it took
Yeah.
was not even a 10-minute like high level tutorial on, okay, here's the economics of SaaS, and here's why 3 months actually costs us more than if
Yeah.
we don't sell to them at all. And that changed. After that, they were like, oh, I get why now. Okay, that makes sense. And that's all it took was the why.
Well, it's amazing that that's not just more widely understood. And again, not again, but I guess I'm saying is that that's a failure of leadership. It should be part of the onboarding. It's just
Yeah.
explaining all that, right? Because you're right. I mean, it's a revelation once people understand. It's like, oh my God, then of course, yeah, that makes total sense. That we have to think differently
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, exactly. Don't need to be like CFO level when it comes to, finances and like the numbers and economics, but yes, a base level. But yeah, and that's, I think, something that every leader should really focus on, is that why, and that alignment. Anything else that you would add there, Peter?
No, I think that covers it.
So you also talk a lot about understanding ideal customer profiles and how CS is well positioned to pull insights and data to help companies' overall ability to sell and support customers. And so I'm quoting that from page 74 of your book. And as you just talked about payback periods, so with payback periods across the SaaS industry rising, can you share with us some of the consequences that you've seen or you believe that occur because of ignoring ICP development?
Yeah, I think probably the most obvious to me and people who kind of see the downstream effects would be churn. A bad fit in your ICP usually means eventually the customer's not going to be happy. So the more obvious signals would be NPS and customer satisfaction. They'll always struggle with you to have a good experience because ultimately they just don't fit. They just don't, the product doesn't work for them. It was sold to them, either their fault or the sales team's fault. Someone, didn't clearly communicate what's going on here and why it's probably not the best environment for the product. But downstream, it has a much more kind of debilitating effect, I think, on the company, the vendor company, because I think what ends up happening is that your support organization is overworked supporting customers who probably will never become successful with products they might have short-term success. They might be able to get past certain hurdles, but they'll always struggle. The customers will always struggle to get the value they expect. And it could be because, probably more often, it's because the product it's not fit for their environment, but sometimes it's because the customers and their own inadequacies around enabling their own people and the skills. And so no matter what the vendor, it might on surface appear like the product should work for these people, but they're just not skilled. And you can't control that. You can try to, convince them that they should be embarking on a certain kind of upgrading of skills, but the customer is the customer and they make their own decisions. So, I think what ends up happening is support organization gets overworked, customer success struggles to get beyond the reactive. You end up having poor staff morale, you have turnover. There's a lot of customer success is always complaining these days about being overworked. A lot of that's because of a bad fit ICP customers. So, and at a broader macro level, it affects the valuation of the company because if churn is just pernicious and you can't really address it, that's not good, because it's not going to attract the kind of investments that you need. And so it really is a bad strategy to not adhere to an ICP that works for you as a company. It's just a lot of wasted energy that doesn't really it's not really monitored or tracked, but we all know it exists. All these post-sales organizations are trying to work with customers who just shouldn't be customers. And to your comment, how you had that experience where someone says, well, isn't short-term revenue better than nothing? The answer is no, not always, because that short-term revenue can't make up for that long-term loss of revenue, or, you're spending all your money on kind of a reactive service that is just super expensive and doesn't really move the needle on anything.
No. And your point about the morale on the team and how it has that long tail effect. When I was a CS, I felt what you were saying, because when I was a CS, was working for an organization and didn't really have a well-defined ICP. It was basically any company with a marketing team, we sell to. And it didn't take me long to figure out as a CSM that was not the case. Anyway, fast forward to this one day, and I was starting to get pretty burnt out because it was like square peg, round hole, and I was exhausted. And I got an email introduction to a customer who was a pharmaceutical company. And as soon as I read that, I'm like, no, not again. And the introduction was, we're introducing you to Elizabeth. She's our best CSM. And that fell on deaf ears at the time. I was like, no, I can't make this customer successful. There's no way. And it was that moment that I decided to quit, because I was just like, I can't do this again. And I think the perception actually at the time was that I quit because I didn't get a promotion that I went for. It came down to me and someone else, and the other very deserving person got the promotion. And so I think there was this perception that I left because I didn't get the promotion. It was because I could not handle the workload. I didn't want to handle the workload anymore from working with companies that were outside of our ICP. I was so burnt out. So when I see CSMs complain about that, I should say complain, but talk about that, I feel for them, because I'm like, yeah, I've been there, and it sucks. And economically, it just doesn't make sense for companies either. So
Yeah. And
go ahead, Indu.
oh, sorry, I was going to say, like, economics and personal ramifications aside, there are so many negative externalities too. Like, that person who may have been a champion before now may leave a bad review or go on and share a bad experience. Like, I know I've had this case where I've worked at a company where the client had used us, CMO, different company, moves to a different company. We know they're not our ICP. We know this is not going to work, but push comes to shove, they become a client of ours. All of a sudden, that good reference, that really reliable client you had in the past, is no longer someone that's an advocate for you because you're not honing in on that ICP.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All of a sudden, there's friction introduced into that relationship that really damages things. And it's, but it feels like I hate to say this, it feels a bit like a losing battle, though, because of the way our economy is structured, and the way companies are valued based on short-term results. So there is all this pressure to produce revenue as quickly as possible. And it's, I know a lot of people in our industry who are trying to really hone in on that ICP message and try and get companies to think differently. And I think there's been progress made, but it feels like we've got a ways to go yet to convince the real decision makers that they should really think differently about the way they operate their businesses, because I'm not sure they're convinced that the long-term effects on staff and even on customers is enough of a drawback compared to the upfront, wins, right? So
yeah. Well, that is our opportunity to sort of be the change here. I think all three of us probably agree that CS teams are pretty equipped to help you understand who that ICP is, just from sheer working with customers that churn and are successful. What do you think sort of helps CS be ideally positioned to help define that ICP?
Yeah, so I think you just mentioned a few things there, Indu, but I think, the working with customers, but working with patterns of customers, I think is critical. And so I wouldn't expect an individual CSM to be so specialized as to say, oh, my portfolio of accounts, or 80% of them fit the ICP. I mean, maybe I think good ones would know that and be able to kind of justify or validate why they believe that. But I think the CS leaders, or at least operations, someone needs to be doing the analysis of figuring out which accounts fit the ICP and why, and are the behaviors that they're exhibiting the kinds of behaviors the company expects their ideal customers to perform on an ongoing basis to achieve the kind of results that they need. So that information, this pattern recognition, is what I'm more interested in from customer success than sort of anecdotal stuff. I'd rather see more machine-driven kind of like information insights that come and flow to, ICP was really born from the marketing organization, right? And so I think marketing could benefit greatly from the experiences of existing customers, and it would validate their belief in an ICP and maybe allow them to refine it and hone in on more precise messaging for the market, more precise enablement for the salespeople. And I think everyone benefits from that kind of circle of information that would result. Too long, the ICP was really just pushed on the company from marketing through sales. And then there was kind of this left there and everyone else had to deal with it. And we know that's a failed product at that point. And so I think to really complete the picture, you need the post-sales organizations to be the work they do with the broad portfolio of accounts needs to be kind of harvested with insights to refine the ICP on an ongoing basis. And as I'm saying that, I think we're not really well equipped to do that because I don't think a lot of leaders yet still think that way in the post-sales world. I mean, I think we need more leaders to think more programmatically than what I see out there.
Yeah. It kind of goes back to your point of cohesion, right? If I'm only focusing on things that are going to improve my job and my role, we're not going to get very far. But if I can take what I'm learning, systemize it, and help the whole company benefit, there are obviously very big positives from that.
Yeah. So as you're saying that, I'm thinking, okay, if I was in a role, an executive role, and I was hiring a new leader of CS, my reflex, going back to my initial bad kind of hire in GTM, I would probably like, I want to hire a data analytics leader, someone who can go in, jump in and crunch
Right.
data.
Yeah. Well, because you're right. It's that like bringing an element of, being programmatic, and then that lends itself to that pattern recognition that you were talking about. And then you can make that knowledge institutionalized. So it's not just, a CSM has that anecdotal, like you said, kind of information and knowledge of their customer base, but then it becomes something that becomes shared across marketing, sales, customer success, product. I think having a common, language and framework is missing as well. Having something where there's a framework that is like, okay, here's the problems that our ICP really needs solving. Like, here are some of the commonalities, not just the ICP, but the personas within the ICP, and being able to put that into a framework that can then be replicated and understood very clearly across all of the teams that impact go-to-market. So yeah, I think we're all on the same page. You should you could probably write a book about this topic in and of itself.
Be cool.
Yeah. All right. So if we have time for one more question, do you have time for one more, Peter?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. So goes a little, I think, about, some of what you were maybe hinting about if I was reading between the lines around some of the decision makers and what they focus on. And some of those decision makers can sometimes be investors, sometimes it's the C-suite, the boards. And one of the topics that has been a really, hot topic this year is bootstrapping versus VC investment versus that, all across LinkedIn, I'm having tons of conversations on it. And the CEO of Pavilion, he even wrote a post about it a week or two back, and he called the VC playbook as being in trouble. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the implications of the customer experience between bootstrapping and VC investment, and, kind of a two-part question. Is there anything about the VC playbook that you think is at odds or detrimental to the customer experience?
I do. I think, and I'll take it up even higher than VCs. I just think it's just a problem with the way our economy works. It's as I said earlier, it rewards short-term results. VCs, it's like on hyperdrive, short-term results. They invest heavily, millions of dollars, and in their defense, they expect returns, of course. Their demands, I like to call it a hostage situation. People who take VC dollars are held hostage at that point, because they can do a lot with the money, but then they're beholden to the expectations of the VCs. And often it runs counter to what the founders or whoever's accepting the investment, have for their customer community. And maybe, I think not just maybe, oftentimes it means there has to be compromises made on longer term kind of organizational kind of structures that they want to build out to address client needs. And instead, investment has to go towards quicker sales, a higher volume of sales. And I think that's where a lot of the problems just start, is that there's not enough patience built into the VC models that allows companies to build out professional organizations that are going to address the whole life cycle of a customer. And that's what, I work for ValueWise Consulting. That's what we're all about. We focus on the entire life cycle, and it's a long play. But at my point in my career, I feel like this is ideal for me. I'm an old guy now, and I don't mind talking about long stuff. It's like, I'm not in it for the short-term gain anymore. I just want to see this whole thing ride out. And I believe in it. I believe a customer has a life cycle, but I don't think the life cycle is addressed adequately. I think we address it when they're first born, but then we let them grow up on their own, and oftentimes they're going to die pretty quickly. And so I think the VC model produces really robust children, but not well-adjusted adults.
Love that. Oh
That's
my
well
gosh.
said.
Kind of murdering a
Such a
metaphor
good
here.
line. Oh my- So if anybody listening does not follow Peter on LinkedIn, I highly recommend it, not just because of his knowledge of go-to-market, but if there was an award for the best one-liners, it would go to Peter because they're always true and like sometimes saying the quiet part loud, but what needs to be said loudly. Anyway, that was gold. I love that.
Yeah. Well, I'm writing an article right now for ValueWise, and I'm talking about this. I didn't use that line, but I might. But it's kind of like that, where I just think that, and I don't just talk about VCs. I'm just talking about in general. Companies pay too much attention on birthing a customer, and then that's it. And we don't worry so much about their long-term health, although we pay lip service to it through structures like customer health scores and all that kind of stuff. But we don't really spend a lot of money or energy on that stuff. And we just expect that, when it comes time, oh, sure, they renew with us. And, it just feels like there's so much work to do. I'm not a pessimist. I'm actually an optimist. I think all this will get resolved in the next 20 years. But I think a lot of it will get resolved through analytical driven kind of technology. And I want to draw a distinction between data driven and analytics driven, because Mark Stoos, again, reminds me of that all the time. And data is one thing, analytics are another. And I subscribe to that latter piece, that it's not the data, it's the insights that you can glean from it. And I think that'll drive, with technology, improvements in how customers are better kind of cared for long term.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I agree with that. And I think once we have those, analytical proof points, I guess, for lack of a better word, people have experienced the pain long enough of neglecting the nurturing from child to adult, to use your analogy, that people will start to avoid it. And particularly CSMs in the last few years who have kind of come into their career when we're really acutely feeling the effects of selling to, bad fit customers and bringing on any customer for that, short-term revenue growth. My hope is they'll, stay in the industry that we have and scare them off. And they'll remember this as they become leaders, and we'll have that analytics that you mentioned, and we'll start to course correct.
Yeah, I thought of that today, actually, Elizabeth, that there's a lot of, I mentioned about the layoffs again, and I think there is a kind of a transformation happening in the sector in terms of the people. So we probably will lose a lot of good talent, and then they'll make the right choices for themselves and go into other parts of business world where they'll find fulfillment and all that stuff. And it might be a loss for this, like SaaS in the area we work in, but then, change happens all the time. We all have to make decisions for ourselves.
Yeah, you're right. Well, this was a fantastic discussion. Really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your insights. Anything else any final parting words before we let you get back to your day and your espresso?
I still have some, actually. Yeah, I'm expecting parting words. I want to thank both of you for the work that you do. I love your LinkedIn presence, both of you. You put some really solid, smart content out there. And I say that as a person who's on LinkedIn a lot, who sees a lot of not smart content. And I think you guys stand out. I look forward to seeing your posts. It's always very thoughtful, and I appreciate that you're trying to drum discipline into the minds of people. And I think that's something really for everyone to remember, is the discipline of jobs. In the age of tech, in the age of artificial intelligence, the discipline of being good at your job will set you apart, I think.
Absolutely.
Well,
And that means a lot. Thank you, Peter.
yes, thank you. That is high praise coming for you. So that truly means a lot. Thank you so much for that.
You're
And
welcome.
completely agree on the discipline. I think that will set people apart for sure. So yes, thank you again for your time. And again, anybody follow Peter on LinkedIn, get his book. You will not regret either. One of the, like I said, best one-liners on LinkedIn there is, if not the best. Thanks again, Peter, and we really appreciate your time and all of your insights that you shared.
Thank you. I appreciate being invited here. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
You're welcome, Indu.